Hello, welcome. It's very exciting to be here with you all. This is a conversation I feel very excited by and hold a lot of evolving curiosities about. And so I'm excited to dig in to it with all of you. And I just wanted to put out there that I realize these are big topics. Like you hear the word religion just thrown out now, and love and identity. And I realize probably everyone in this room has very different opinions and feelings. And so I invite you to bring those in with you and maybe have an openness of knowing that there will be polar opposite ideas in the room here as well. And so just how can we hold space for all of that today? So I'm really excited to talk with the three of you, huge admirers of all of your work. And I feel like so much of the work you've put out has very much impacted even who I am. So it's so cool to be chatting with you. I'm going to read your bios. So here we go. I'll go in the order that it's written. So Samra Habib is a writer, photographer, and activist. Their best-selling memoir, We Have Always Been Here, is an exploration of faith, art, love, and queer sexuality, a journey that takes them to the far reaches of the globe to uncover a truth that was within them all along. It's a triumphant memoir of forgiveness and family, both chosen and not, and a rallying cry for anyone who has ever felt out of place, and a testament to the power of fearlessly inhabiting one's truest self. As a journalist, they've covered topics ranging from fashion trends and Muslim dating apps to the rise of Islamophobia in the US. Their writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Advocate, and their photo project, Just Me and Allah, has been featured in Nylon, ID, Vanity Fair Italia, Vice, and The Washington Post. Samra works with LGBTQ organizations internationally, raising awareness of issues that impact queer Muslims around the world. Cool. Okay, we don't have to do the whole clap. It's okay, we'll keep going. That is Samra. Yeah, it's in a different order. Yeah, we'll clap, yeah. I'm making you guess who it is. Why don't I go in this order then? Rahim Thawer works as a psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, facilitator, and public speaker, sessional lecturer, writer, and community organizer. He began working in the HIV/AIDS sector in 2008 and dedicated over a decade to LGBTQ Muslim community organizing. He was welcomed as an international visiting scholar with the South African College for Applied Psychology for the 2021-2022 academic year and has taught as a lecturer at multiple universities in Canada. He's an appointed fellow at the Bondman Center for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto for his contributions to the field of sexuality. He was also a co-editor and contributor for an anthology entitled Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Toronto Book Awards. Jad Jaber is a postdoctorate researcher, is the founder of Marginalized Majority, a nonprofit community-focused organization implementing programs focused on the individual and community health and healing of 2S LGBTQIA+ equity-deserving groups. The organization has serviced nearly 9,000 individuals since the pandemic and has partnered up with the biggest Canadian organizations, including a yearly in-person weekly program at the 519. Jad has created and led the equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy and programs for the nonprofit since its founding. Also a board director on Toronto's Pride for 3 years, Jad has worked as a consultant within the sensitive spaces of EDI, corporate strategy, academia, research, and program management and development. Jad is a published peer-reviewed author of multiple books and articles, including Queer Arab Language, and has worked internationally in Europe and the Swana region with Save the Children, the World Bank, as well as other international funding and human rights organizations.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Awesome. So I know a lot of people have not seen this play, and so we're going to just be using that as kind of a starting off point to dive into these questions that I prepared for you all. So I thought we could begin, a big part of this piece is very much, I found, about this setting of this small town of rural Alberta, and just thinking about how space and these places can create such formative experiences on our sense of self. So I was wondering if the three of you could talk about what your upbringings looked like and if you were surrounded by a religious or religious communities, and how those communities impacted your sense of being, how they added pressures to you, maybe as a child or an adult. And then I also want to sneak in what you may have gained from those experiences as well. You can it doesn't have to be like the line, but you know, it could be easier.
Okay, I grew up in a traditional Arabic household. My whole life was in the Arab world, between Egypt and Dubai and mostly Lebanon. I moved to Toronto 3.5 years ago. I think it's a very big issue to discuss what these small spaces of faith are able to create for queerness. Because most of the times when you're over here, people believe that these spaces of faith are contradictory to queerness. When in my research, in my book, our cultures, our Arabic cultures, make queerness, are the most fertile grounds for queerness, right? So the way we pray, the way we go to funerals, the way we celebrate, the gender markers that exist everywhere, that simply allows for more queerness to exist in all our spaces. And it does. And it's about maneuvering. For me, being safe in these spaces is having a real strong cultural awareness and knowing how to maneuver around. And there's no such thing as necessarily safe or unsafe, because you can feel very unsafe as a racialized queer person in Toronto. And you can feel very safe as a queer Arab in Saudi Arabia at a gay party. So it's about that discrepancy, yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I can go next.
Yeah.
So I came to Canada as a refugee when I was 10. And you know, the mosque really became one of the very few places where I could feel safe, or my mom could feel safe. It was one of the very few places where, you know, I sort of felt like I really felt seen in ways that I didn't in the outside world. And obviously, you know, later on, I had also really not so great experiences at the mosque. But that, I think, was really formative for me. And I think what I carried with me through that experience was sort of that same sense of community where you have a shared language with other folks. And I feel like the spirit of that experience is really something I carry with me, you know, in new communities that I am a part of, or even in relationships. So I think that is the spirit of that is really something that is really ingrained in me still.
I grew up just around the corner in Etobicoke. And, you know, so when I saw the play, and we're talking about rural Alberta, Etobicoke's not like that. But it does make me think about the way cities are set up and the way suburban life is sought after, and how insular it can be. So there could be a whole history of you and your people, but it doesn't quite feel like within reach because of how the city's designed. You're in the suburb, you're in an enclave, you have to use a car, and you get in that car to just see other people like yourself, or go to Costco. Like, those are, you know. And so when I think about growing up in a suburb and in a Muslim community, there are some beautiful things about that. Lots of support, lots of people who wanted me to do well and would celebrate me, but also the insularity is also a bit suffocating, or at least it was for me. Because if you want to challenge the way people do things or the way that they think, there isn't always space for that, I found. So I'm relating to this experience of rural Alberta and thinking about how there's something very emotionally safe about being in a small place with your people, but also how limiting it can feel. And then at a point, once you get a taste of what it could be like after, like outside of that, you re-experience that small enclave as suffocating almost. And you're not sure how you can continue to grow as a person. And that, to me, that's one of the most painful things, is to think or to feel like I've outgrown my roots or where I came from.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's this constant kind of dichotomy of spaces, and it's never one or the other. It's just, it's what it is, and you're shifting that evolution as we keep getting older. And then I guess now I'm kind of jumping ahead to, you know, shame is a very fun word, and something that's very embedded with this piece. This character is very much struggling with this shame that kind of follows him in all aspects of his life. And I am curious about, you know, this dichotomy, this normalcy of duplicity of our identities. What's your journey of navigating these ideas of shame, and how you exist within that, in those different spaces? It's a big question, and I don't know where you want to go with it today, but wherever that feels, yeah.
You know, when you say that, the story is coming into my mind as a child. You know, when we first came to Canada, my mom would pack me like a burrata in a newspaper, and, you know, I would be so embarrassed, and kids would make fun of me, and I would just, you know, like go like hide it, throw it away, and get mad at my mom for packing me a burrata. And I'm just thinking, like, now, you know, I would do anything to have like burrata. I like drive to like the suburbs to have burrata, you know. So I just, you know, I guess shame for me it's sort of like, you know, unpacking shame is really an ongoing process, and really kind of closely examining parts of me that, you know, I have been really ashamed of because they might scream my Pakistaniness. But, you know, in my 40s, I'm working so hard at really kind of unpacking the impact of that and how it showed up in different parts of my life, how I have, you know, failed to express myself in ways that feel so natural to me, and what I can do to repair that. So really, that is what I'm thinking about, like my Pakistaniness, and you know, really kind of expressing myself in ways that seem really palatable to like North American people, usually like white people, right? So really, I feel like I'm unpacking that like every day. Like why am I expressing myself this way? Why not this other way that would have seemed like a really natural route, you know? I think that's also just so inherent. Like the Pakistaniness is, it's not just this is the thing, it's like all of these things are being juggled at the same time, as we all know. But what's maybe at the forefront right now is changing in what you're navigating.
Yeah, I would say that a great person to follow up with on shame, sorry, is a person called Dr. Rula Kahil. She's a UFT and UTM professor, and she's written about shame for 15 years from a kind of like global south perspective. She calls shame the mother of all emotions, and she says that all of the emotions of guilt and internal insecurity that we feel, most of it falls under the umbrella of shame. So in our culture, shame is it's a tool, okay? And it's a tool to control queer bodies of women, bodies of everyone that falls under the marginalized category. And what's amazing about shame is you don't need to keep shaming someone. You can just shame them once and they're internalize the shame for the rest of their lives. So it's a way of control for the rest of your lives. My mom, for example, in terms of shaming me from my femininity, would never tell me before we go into my cousin's house, watch out, don't play with the Barbie, you'll embarrass me if you play with the Barbie. She would actually watch me while she sips on the coffee until I played with the Barbie, and then come from behind me and not just shout, but physically hold me from my waist and go like, what are you doing? What are you doing? So my body would go through a somatic heave when it comes to shame. And for example, one of the ways that I had to deal with it in the future is how to get rid of my physical resistance to femininity, because it's been instilled into me, within me, by something like shame.
Wow. Yeah. Rahim, do you want to
Yeah, sure. I'm just sitting with this somatic experience of shame, which is quite powerful. I think about shame and the sources of shame that can be unique to everybody, but also there's probably so many similarities. When you talk about like wanting to throw your lunch away, I also did that. And now I think in present day, if you had a burrito wrapped up in a newspaper, that would be the trendiest thing.
I know.
That would be so fabulous.
With some kebab, you know?
Yeah. And what's unfortunate is that the way I think or some of us, or I have learned to confront shame is through white supremacy, right? I'm like, oh, white people also do this, so like, it's fine. I should be proud of that, right? So, and that's like, it's pretty strong. It's everywhere, you know? I think in gay men's communities, being a person of color, especially when I was first coming out, proximity to whiteness was quite important because, like, I mean, I can critique obviously the system of whiteness, but it also was like this separate area that seemed safe to explore who I am because it was far away from my people. But being in that space also made me hate myself more.
Yeah.
So like it's pretty fucked, right? This is like, it provides emotional safety, but also you're gonna feel a lot, like you're gonna be punched at a lot.
Yeah.
So that's, I find that to be complicated. I would just put out there though, I think when I think about what shame means, I'm thinking about it as like an all-encompassing sense of inferiority, right? And when it gets activated in a particular situation, those are moments where I would like feel particularly exposed, wanting to hide, and feeling like there's something about what I've done or what I'm putting out there that like I want to shield away, you know? And so that can be like embarrassing your family or letting a father down. That could also be being rejected on a dating app. Like there's a range of these experiences in the world that activate that shame.
I guess then I'm, you know, to go back even then a little bit is, you know, growing up then, these images, this idea of queerness or whatever word made sense at that time, how was that being presented to you, and was it something that felt, you know, this idea of this doesn't, I go to these spaces and I feel the shame even to this day or whatever, but was there something that felt like this is for me, this is not for me because of the way it was presented? And I guess I'll say particularly in regards to the whiteness of queer culture, and for me it's definitely been a very monolithic representation of gay men and the gay male movement, and I was like, oh, it's definitely not me, so this will take a really long time to figure out. But I'm just curious about going into that for you.
We had no, so I grew up in a world and in a space, and where many of it still exists, because it's good for us to acknowledge the privileges that we exist in today in this situation. But there's still many places where queer culture, queer objects, and queer subjects are prohibited. So when you don't grow up with I'm a white passing Arab, and I acknowledge the privileges of being that, especially from my culture, which has a lot of anti-black racism, a lot of colorism. But when you feel that sense of, when you grow up in that culture, the only thing that permeates through social media are the images of white, chiseled, blue-eyed men. So for a lot of Arabs and POCs and a lot of people in the global south, that image of whiteness is what you grow up with. In a lot of my work, a lot of my research, you'll hear there was a lot of queer Arabs that would say that my only sense of power was watching these white couple from Jersey on Queer Eye get married. Or my only sense of power was seeing, you know, these archetypal white men, but they didn't have anything cultural to build that up from. Everyone who had that archetype of queerness had to deal with issues of shame. Because eventually you had to discover, you had to look at your own body and your own mind and your own background and notice that you're not that. And that you exist in a spectrum of preference in the queer community, where whiteness is at the top. And you have to find yourself in that hierarchy. Thankfully, there's a lot of work that's being done to dismantle this at this point, but for a very, very long time, that hierarchy was pretty clear.
For sure. You know, I'm thinking about how, you know, sometimes when I look back at, you know, queer pop culture content that I consumed like a decade ago, you know, what was prioritized, you know, coming out, gay marriage, and even now, you know, there's really a hyper focus on representation, which is, you know, great. But, you know, Rahim, I was thinking about this conversation you and I had 10 years ago, and I was really, what stuck with me about that was kind of like reimagining a role where we've kind of surpassed that. Do you know what I mean? Where representation and coming out are no longer, like we've already crossed that bridge, right? And I'm really, really kind of interested in, you know, how we would look kind of inward in terms of maybe like the harm that we can also cause as queer people, a narrative that is beyond just perpetually being a former victim or another, right? Like what can we do differently? What can we do better? And how we can better show up for different various folk or in relationships. So that is, yeah, that is, I don't know if I sort of went away from your question, but that's kind of what I was thinking about. And, you know, those narratives didn't really, create room for other kinds of stories or other kind of things that, you know, I was grappling with at the time. So it just felt extra isolating, right? You know, this is kind of like a group of folk that is supposed to speak to my experience, but that wasn't really the case.
Thanks for remembering a conversation from 10 years ago. I don't know that I remember the exact conversation, but I taking, like from what you've said, you know, what I still think about is what the world can look like if like being a secular Muslim was a thing. You know, or like if I told somebody, oh, I'm Muslim and atheist, or I'm culturally Muslim, like they wouldn't like lose their mind. Because like I do think a lot of like white Christians can do that. They can be like, oh, I'm gonna do Easter, I'm gonna do Christmas, and like I kind of believe in this, I don't necessarily believe in that. I feel like there's this pressure for us to like say what it is we believe in and then demonstrate it. We have to perform it. Like I have to perform for somebody else, like fasting or doing this or doing that, and like that comes from within a community that's worried about how we look on the outside. That comes from the outside because I don't know, I feel like the white gaze is trying to figure out if we're like, I think they're trying to evaluate our citizenship in a funny way. Like, are you a good adherent to your faith, and then do you do good things, and then you like, and it's that all of it. It's so heavy. Like, go away, you know. Like I just want to experience the like freedom of, first of all, just freedom, you know, but freedom of also like not like if I say that I believe in God, I don't want someone to think I'm backwards and like anti-intellectual, and if I tell somebody I'm atheist or I don't care about prayer, I don't want them I don't want to feel like I've abandoned somebody or that I've like traded my culture for something else, something that's dominant. Like I feel like these options aren't readily available, and that I just want so much of that.
Yeah, like can we hold two things and be like, yeah, both things are true, and that can be it as well. And
4 things. Sometimes.
7 things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that links to coming out, which is what you mentioned like a while ago, and how there's a lot of queer people are expected to come out in this, you know, I call it the twink TikTok way. You know, how like white twinks come out on TikTok and then their moms and aunties hug them next morning. That doesn't really exist in my culture. So I'll find a lot of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, late 20s, all ages, feeling guilty about and shame about their queer journey. And saying, you know, am I lacking? Was I deficient? Did I miss out on something that I didn't come out like that TikTok twink? What was wrong in my psyche? What was wrong in my sense of safety? What was wrong? And I always tell them that you can't mimic that journey. First, you have to trust the path that you're on. Second, I don't speak about coming out anymore. I speak about coming in, because it's about letting people into your sanctuary, letting people into your safety, letting people into your truth, letting folks into your circle of trust, not necessarily having that concept of going out to the world, going out on TikTok, letting the world know, you know, which also aligns with hyper-individuality and leaving the family home and all these things that don't exist in our culture. So, yeah, just wanted to circle back to that little point.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because it is this idea of how do we move beyond this narrative of, okay, coming out, and what can the world look like in a way that we don't have to keep spending time on this thing that we did in like 2003. It's like, okay, now what's next? And then I do think about, like, there is still that idea of like, okay, so then is there room for actual acceptance? And I actually am like trying to understand what that word means, because to me it's become synonymous with tolerated, and it's this idea of, oh yes, we tolerate you in spaces, all the spaces, Muslim communities, queer communities, whatever. It's like there's a toleratingness, but what do I actually want as acceptance? And what, I don't know, I'm curious if you, where you're at with that question, or if this is also a 2003 question.
Do you mean, just point of clarification, do you mean acceptance by like folks who are not queer, or?
I don't know, I guess I wonder, is there room for actual acceptance and not just being tolerated? And I don't know which side you want to go on with it. Is that being accepted in Muslim spaces as a queer person? Is it being whatever identities you want to take on in your faith in queer communities? I don't know. Yeah.
Who wants to go?
Tolerance is a great examples of tolerance. I've spent a long time as well writing about this. When I came out to, when I came into my mom and forcibly, let's just scratch this. When my mom forced me to come out, within years afterwards, after her supposedly acceptance journey towards me, I would hear things from people who have supposedly accepted me. Things like, and trigger warning, everyone, things like, I can accept that you're queer, but if you look effeminate, I'll hurt you. I can accept that you're gay, but if you ever bring another gay man into this household, I will hurt. I can accept that you're, that you know, all these caveats, right? So then I noticed that I thought I was being accepted while I was really having an eggshell relationship with those that have accepted me. And that very fragile relationship was causing me more anxiety and stress than actually being either rejected or accepted. So I took a decision at some point that I will not be tolerated by anyone, and that I will sharpen my intuition and my emotional intelligence to know when I'm being tolerated, to know when these sentences are said to me, and to know that I deserve more, and to hold that bar higher for myself and expect more from people. Acceptance is deep, and tolerance is stressful.
I think that we're really new in our acceptance journey. I feel like, you know, if you kind of look around you during Pride, you would think that we're there. We're like all about acceptance, but I feel like we're really far away from, you know, allies internalizing what acceptance looks like, how to actually make folks, you know, who are queer comfortable if you're sharing space with them, not to, you know, put pressure on them to speak for, you know, the entire queer community, you know, how to actually create more opportunities for queer folks that would sort of create like an equal, you know, level playing field. So I feel like it's just really, really messy.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So messy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a spectrum of acceptance in different contexts. So like when I was dating my ex-partner for, I don't know, 5-6 years, we lived together, and my mom sometimes would send me food. She loved, like, this is her love language. And so she's cooking a home cooked curry, or probably 3, and then it's overpackaged with cellophane. She loves that. And she'll always be like, will Mason eat this? Does Mason like this? And she really didn't have the language, the politics. She never sought out external support. She couldn't come to a lot of my things that were gay. And I grieve that. I still feel sad about that. But I think this was the kind of acceptance she could offer. And I don't want to minimize that, right? I think there's a kind of this explicit, loud and proud thing. I like it. I do like it. It does work for me. But I think I would lose out on some very important familial relationships if I expected everybody in my family to do that. They just don't, they don't necessarily know how, and knowing how and wanting to, and it's a function of a lot of things. And education, class, exposure, willingness, their own emotional safety, there's all kinds of things. So I think a lot about the nuances of what acceptance can look like.
Yeah.
And if people are doing their best at various points, what are the ways that they show love? You know? That I want to be open to. And then I'm also thinking about, Jad, this, we talk about this hierarchy of desire and the privilege of whiteness. You know, as a therapist, I see so many white folks, and people of color, but white folks I'm naming in particular, who are gay men who struggle with body image, even though their bodies look, well, whatever. All of our bodies look great, but they have specific goals around their bodies and they're reaching them. But one of the ways we conceptualize this regimentedness around diet and exercise and restriction and discipline, in so many ways, those are words that help us manage our shame.
100%.
You know, so I'm going to really curate what you see on the outside so that I can cover up all of this pain on the inside. And so even when those people who represent a lot of power in the world, when we get to their individual stories, I think they're also not sure what acceptance looks like, even though they're well represented in the communities and they make us feel like we don't know where our place is. I don't think I don't think white gays have come together and also had a think tank, you know, about what they imagine queerness can be. That's lacking. I think we haven't imagined collectively what freedom can be in that way.
Yeah. It's acceptance. External acceptance starts with self-acceptance. And healed people heal people the same way that harmed people harm people. And if you haven't gone through that really deep, harsh journey of self-acceptance, especially as BIPOC queers, we are going to spread the lack of acceptance horizontally, which is known as horizontal violence. There has to be a real deep journey for self-acceptance for you to really accept others. And I can see it in a lot of my Global South queers that have gone on many journeys, but not the self-acceptance journey, right? They've gone on 30 different prides across Europe, but not a single self-acceptance journey. And it's that single self-acceptance journey that's gonna make them not transphobic, or that's gonna make them not hate the feminine within them, or that's gonna make them not hate the other aspects of queerness and adjectives and attributes within them that, as Rahim mentioned, don't align with whiteness. As long as you really haven't done that really difficult journey, I think you'll always find yourself rejecting yourself and rejecting others.
Yeah. Shoot. Okay, good. Yeah. It's a lot to take in. Yeah. I mean, I think that's so fascinating because we're really given this image of this is what acceptance is. We can go on our phone and scroll and people are shouting from the rooftops, which is also cool if you want to shout from rooftops, and also how that can become internalized, though, of what we should necessarily achieve to feel that love, which is this inward self-love, actually. I guess I'm interested then in grand scale of also where this is coming from, in this play, this character, this protagonist, is taken under the wing of this evangelical Christian pastor. And that relationship of whiteness and Christian evangelical ideologies is interesting, especially I think in this country, and I'm curious if you feel like this is a perspective that's become quite monopolized when we think about queerness and gender and religion in Canada. Yeah, do it.
Oh, you know, I kind of see where you're going with the question. And I think that, okay, whew, maybe I shouldn't have gone first. I think that, okay, the evangelical Christian in the play makes me think about the kind of fluidity that is allowed when you have a certain amount of privilege. So like, I could say one thing, like I could evangelize, I could talk about a religion, I could talk about doctrine. I could also secretly harbor these feelings around same-sex sexuality or queer sexuality. And even though there's like this dichotomy that feels troubling and problematic, I think the power that person has allows them to move in the world in a unique way, which is not afforded to everybody. And the parallel example that comes to my mind is, having worked in HIV/AIDS for a long time, we often will talk about gay, bisexual men and men who have sex with men. And men who have sex with men are people who, well, we're talking about behavior, not identity. Mm-hmm. And so important to provide services to this community, but there's lots of stuff going on in their world where they're living in multiple worlds. And as much as they're struggling, I often would think to myself, you're married in a heterosexual relationship, you're struggling in so many ways, but also it's because you're a man, you have the privilege of being able to leave your wife at home with kids and be elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So like, you're struggling, but there's another part of your identity that gives you mobility. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the big difference between Izzy and some of the other characters. I think he has less mobility, mm-hmm. and they just have a bit more. They have the option to not care. They have the option to be free. There's this, like, having ideas and thinking in a bigger way doesn't feel like it comes with consequences. Mm. And Izzy himself, I just think about how small his world has to be. Like, his name is Ishmael, or Ismail, and he has to go by Izzy. Yeah. And they alternate between the two, which I'm thinking, like, who is this for? How hard is your name? But to me, it speaks to like how constrained a person might be, mm-hmm. you know, and like the limitations within which they have to explore all of themselves. Like, they just don't have the same mobility as other people.
Yeah, 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 and also, you know, the play. What I was thinking about it, you know, it also feels very specific to a place like Alberta, mm-hmm. or like a small town, and how, you know, if you're not maybe accepted by your family, how that can seem like that sort of whiteness can feel like a safe place for you in that circumstance, right? And I was thinking about how susceptible that can make you to harm and kind of danger, and just how vulnerable that makes you. So that is kind of what I was thinking about when that was happening, and I was sort of seeing that character unfold. Even though, you know, that is also very harmful in the end, but it can at the moment feel like, if you don't really have a community, you know, that can feel mm-hmm. like a safe space. Of course. You know?
Yeah, the play definitely, Izzy's character definitely, there was an intensity in that, in the representation of that character, because it was trying to show you all the intersectional variables that are there that control that person's behavior, their faith, their background, their culture, their body type, their everything that was very, the fact that the other person the other boy was also blonde and white. And so I would have started that play with a scene, right? And I know many of us, whoever belongs to BIPOC cultures, we all know that when we have families and a light baby is born, how all the families are like, oh my God, a light baby was born. A blue-eyed white baby has been born. And that's how I would have started that play. I would have started that play with, because this is the precedent that allowed that character to idolize and listen and really be so permeable to that person, to that priest. So we do grow up in a culture that does romanticize that existence, that does romanticize whiteness, that does make you think that if you see something that's is white that's happening, that's probably the right way. And more so as immigrants, because as immigrants, for example, when I'm dealing with new-coming immigrants, they will look at what white men do to know if they can cross a light, to know if they should drink from the water fountain in the gym before others, to know how to deal in private and personal spaces, to know how to hold their body. They will look at white men to know how to do that. So there is that really internalized romanticism of whiteness. And I think for Izzy's character, had he grown up, and this could have really happened in the Arab world, had he been surrounded by sheikhs, that wouldn't have been the same as that pastor. Even though the sheikhs sermon the same, they speak from faith, they are as persuasive. But the effect of the sheikh on Izzy would not have been the same effect of that white pastor on him.
Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, even pushing further, like, because of colonization, you go to anywhere else in the world, and this idea of queerness is a product of, the Western culture and from this white idea, but they're all having the same conversation actually in different ways and pushing that same perspective almost.
Plus queerness historically, record-wise, did belong to global South countries.
Yeah. Just want to make sure. I have more questions, but I also want to check in if people here wanted to ask some questions perhaps. Or you can think about it for a few minutes and I'll go back to asking a question and then we can do that. Or why don't we just have you ask a question if you
want. I'm wondering where the idea of a small town in Alberta came from, because I lived in one and there was one Muslim guy. But he was Ismaili.
Okay.
Oh, that's my people.
Shout out.
Well, I think Makram is.
I think I think the playwright is actually from Alberta, and so there's a semi-autobiographical component to that.
I hope they're not related.
Who knows? I assume not. While people maybe think of a few more questions, and I can go to this question that I'll try my best to word this in a way that, take what you can from it, and then let's see what happens. Because I was curious, and we kind of touched upon it, but there are these very gendered roles that we see in this play that is quite interesting, I think. There's the character of Hawa and Rebecca, who have a very clear role as these reproductive people who are bringing life. And the male characters are majority living these duplicate lives of differences, maybe I'll say. And so I'm curious, from that, were there things that came up for you in regards to these ideas, again, around how we think of gender, and especially these gendered narratives within queer stories? I'm gonna do it, so we did it,
Go ahead, Samra.
Yeah, we know.
I was thinking about how restrictive those gender roles are. Like, of course we can talk about the queer community, but like how even, the people who were carrying this child, like it just sort of seemed like it wasn't really something that they were truly happy with. And I think I shared this with you earlier, like it actually really made me feel really bad or sad for straight people, because I feel like they're kind of on this conveyor belt of progress, you know, you buy a house, you get married, you have a child, and just I think, you know, as queer people, we're just so used to just reimagining a different kind of future because there's never been a place for us anyway. So that is kind of what I was thinking about. Like, it just feels so restrictive even to people who are sort of operating within it.
And I think the restrictiveness, like the theme that comes out of it is that people feel like they're constantly failing gender.
Exactly.
And it's, you know, it's such a, I mean, when you talk about embracing femininity, you know, I feel like everyone around me is trying, like, many straight women in my life are trying to have children at the moment, and they feel so awful when it can't happen right away or the way that they imagined. Or if they've chosen not to, there's this onslaught of like questioning. So if I don't want to have children, my masculinity isn't questioned in the same way that their femininity is questioned. But also, I think without adhering to a more rigid gender role, I think people don't know what my role should be in the family. You know? So those restrictive roles are a vehicle to like connect with people for acceptance, all this kind of stuff. But I think we constantly feel like we're failing gender in a way. And like I've had conversations with I'm thinking of like Uber drivers, you know? One Uber driver who was telling me like, I have 11 kids. And I was like, why? Like that's like in this economy, why?
Exactly.
And then he said, well, and I could have another if I wanted. I'm like, babe, don't brag about that. This is not a good look.
No.
Because you can't, like, it's hard to support 2 kids. Why do you have 11?
Yeah.
But there's something about like, that's uncritical about what my role is, and if I can make somebody pregnant, like, it's so stupid. But also, it's so central to this person that they don't even know to be ashamed to be bragging about this, you know, because they're like, I'm fulfilling my role. But like, it doesn't make sense necessarily, you know? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, sweet.
I'll leave it with the Uber driver.
Gender roles are definitely, the more you move towards BIPOC and global South families, the more restrictive gender roles are, and it's important for us to acknowledge that. The second thing is it's good to give credit for the play because it described gender roles in a very reductionist and limited way, but that is, in my culture, what gender roles are like.
Sure.
So you gotta give credit for that really narrow gender construct, because really, this is what it exists like in real life for many, many people. And as Rahim mentioned, it's difficult for us to look, well, we want to look and be like, what are you doing? Like, you know, but then we also have to center their experience and how much that gender role is an important part of their identity formation. And I also would link that gender role to homophobia, transphobia, and the harms against queers. Because I can only say again from my culture and my experience, but gender roles are so constructive and so limited that many times the women in my culture are forced to hold the flag of toxic patriarchy ahead before the men. They're forced to be more homophobic. They're forced to be more violent against queers. And I don't want to say the term necessarily forced, just they've internalized many times the patriarchy. And also it's good to know that women in my culture are often victims of the patriarchy. So if a child is queer, they're not gonna blame the father. They're gonna blame the mother. They're gonna blame the matriarchs. So it is the woman's role, again, to internalize that toxic patriarchy and that homophobia and transphobia in her children, because that's how she protects her children from the patriarchs of the family. It's a difficult thing for us to see, but again, these gender roles really play a lot into how we as queers are able to behave and how much freedom we have and how much Izzy had freedom in the play. That's the very limited ordinances through which Izzy was able to behave from. Yeah.
You know, one thing in the play that really stood, like as you're talking about gender, Izzy tries to stop somebody from, I think, shooting the deer or shooting somebody. And then he says, "What's the matter with you? Are you a faggot? What's like, are you gay?" And then I think they fuck or something. But obviously. But what really I thought was interesting there was like how not wanting to kill an animal or like caring about the environment or caring about other species was feminized. It's like, that really struck me. Because I recently have been thinking like, you know, it would be good for the, like, I want to stop caring about whether I eat halal or not. I'm like, in this world, in the climate crisis, if I actually care about animals, I should probably stop eating them altogether. And then, but people have like, they sometimes struggle with that idea. And that play made me think about how what they're struggling with is like, as a man, you should eat meat. You know, even that is what I eat is also gendered. Just weird.
For sure.
Restricted and reductive gender roles work with everyone. They don't just work if a woman in a family household, his gender role is very narrow. That means that the man's role within the same household is also very narrow, and the child's role is also. So everyone ends up with these very narrow gender roles.
Great. Just want to check in on the time from the institution of 5 minutes? Cool.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
3 minutes.
Okay. It's all good. Two truths. Did anyone want to ask a question as we finish off and leave into the afternoon? No pressure. There's a lot that has been talked about. I did want to maybe then end off on this huge question of where you all are at currently, maybe with when you have to describe your spiritual journey or how you answer that question, and how maybe your evolution with the even concept of religion or God or faith has shifted in and of itself. Do we want to finish on that question? I don't know. It seems like nice.
I mean, I'm thinking.
It does seem nice.
Yeah, I'm thinking about. I think about spirituality as not a practice, not a series of rituals, but like an experience.
Yeah.
So like, I really don't believe in very much. Like I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in very much, but if I'm in a congregation at a mosque, I'm thinking about how do I feel in this collective space and how that's a spiritual experience. But also, I have a spiritual experience when I do MDMA with a close friend, you know? Yeah. So like I'm thinking about altered states of being and experiencing the world where like you can feel an expansiveness in your heart. And being curious about that is just about all I'm interested in. And I really like cultural rituals because I abandoned them for a while, and I realized that casting my own people as regressive and backward was just, I was reinforcing a kind of white supremacy, when actually like those rituals they're beautiful and they're a medium for connection. And if I could just allow people to ascribe different meaning to it, we don't all have to participate in the same way and take the same thing away from it. And for me, that feels very important. So that because the religious institution is like the medium through which I connect with a lot of my family. So I don't want to erase that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still figuring out what my relationship to my faith is, but you know, it's definitely, I find the connective tissue is sort of a shared language, a shared experience that sort of feels really spiritual to me. And, you know, I still find myself, you know, if I'm at an Eid prayer, just listening to recitation of Azan, like I can't help but get goosebumps after all this time. Like I can't describe it. It's just how I feel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been on a, if you want, two-way spiritual journey. One is more generalist and one is more individual, personal. The generalist is the exact opposite of Rahim's experience, which is I am connected and believe in everything and everyone, and I am in my meditations recently. So I come from a faith called Druze, which is an Abrahamic, very small minority religion.
Yeah.
And recently, in my very deep meditations, I'm starting to go back to a lot of my religious and cultural queer ancestors, and imagining what their unwitnessed journeys must have been like, and kind of connecting to that storyline and seeing my purpose and who I am in my healing journey as part of that really intergenerational and ancestral queer journey of faith as well. And on a personal basis, I think we're all on a healing journey, and one of the biggest steps of that healing journey is boundary formation as queer folks, not having leaky boundaries and having clear boundaries, especially for many of us who've come from a lot of trauma. And a lot of immigrant folks, their boundaries are super leaky. So that is my journey in terms of making sure my boundaries are clear and knowing what I deserve through these boundaries and not being scared through my imposter syndrome to establish these boundaries for people around me.
Whoa. This I almost want to borrow this from like the part where you said witnessing what my ancestors would have had to go through, that feels very powerful.
Yeah.
So I just want to like echo it again, and I wish I thought of that. It's really something.
Yeah.
But you've queered a kind of, like, I often think about the immigrant journey as quite heteronormative in a way, because it's laced with this idea of like sacrifice. But the sacrifice only makes sense if you think about having children and passing something on. So I often think my queer way of being in the world disrupts the purpose of my family's immigration. And that's like unfortunate, but also you're making me think about how there is room for queerness in that migrant journey and embracing ancestors. So thank you. It's nice.
Yeah. Well, thank all of you. I think we're at time now, but yes. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the three of you.
Yay! We did it.
Yes.
On a Sunday.
That was great.
Sunday,
Yeah.